So for the sake of time, we'll get started. Thank you all so much for being here today for our Evaluating Effectiveness and Quality Flash Talks. We have 4 very exciting presentations lined up. I'm going to go in order of the program, and then I'll do a quick introduction. Oh, I guess I should say I'm Margaret Anton. I'm a senior manager of clinical innovation and research at 2 Chairs, and I will be your moderator today. I'll do quick intros of our speakers and talks, and then you'll each share your own screens and have about 5 to 7 minutes to present, and then we'll have a few minutes after each for questions, and then if there's more time at the end, we can ask any lingering questions. Because this is a relatively small group, if people are comfortable, I'd love for questions to be coming off mute and chatting. But if you're not comfortable with that and want to put questions in the chat, that's totally fine. But I'd love for this to be a nice conversational group. So we will get started with our web-based interpretation bias training to reduce anxiety presentation by Jeremy Eberle. Is that correct?
That's right.
Perfect.
Excellent. Let me share my screen here. Can everyone see my slides? Excellent. Great. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about interpretation bias training today. These are the results of a sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. And as you can see here, it's a large team at the University of Virginia. I'm a PhD candidate in clinical psychology, and there are other clinical psychologists on this team, as well as our collaborators in computer science and systems engineering. So a few acknowledgements. I want to thank our whole team. This is a study from the Mind Trails project. And I'd like to thank the different labs involved and NIMH for our funding. So as many of you are likely aware, anxiety disorders are common but undertreated. There's this large treatment gap. Many people need treatment, few people get it. And our team is interested in targeting disorder-relevant biases directly in a way that could be scalable to help reduce that treatment gap. Cognitive models of anxiety suggest that shifting interpretation biases, this tendency of anxious people to interpret ambiguous situations as threatening, could have an impact on anxiety. And there's some indications, some evidence that cognitive bias modification paradigms that target these biases directly may help shift those biases and anxiety symptoms. Just to give you an idea of what this cognitive bias modification paradigm, or CBMI, looks like, here's an example scenario. We give participants a lot of practice in this intervention, encountering ambiguous situations and seeing that they can resolve in a positive way. The idea is to promote flexible thinking about ambiguity rather than rigid negative thinking that many people with anxiety tend to have. So here's a sample scenario. It says, as you're walking down a crowded street, you see your neighbor on the other side. You call out, but she does not answer you. Standing there in the street, you think that this must be because she was. And so up to this point, everything is ambiguous. We don't know, does she hate you? She doesn't want to say hi, or what's going on? What we do is we promote a positive resolution to this ambiguous situation by giving a word fragment for the word distracted. And so participants fill in the word fragment by selecting one of these tiles below. They select T as the correct answer to this scenario. And so by giving participants dozens of these scenarios, we hope to train a positive contingency so that rather than expecting a negative outcome, they can see that there might be a positive resolution. So a challenge, and there's evidence to show that these paradigms can shift symptoms, but a challenge that's common to many digital mental health interventions is retention. There are high rates of attrition, and we ask participants to complete 5 sessions of training, 40 scenarios per session. It should take about 15 minutes, but the rates of actually completing all 5 sessions are pretty low. And it may be that some users require more support. So we have this intervention on our website. It's completely self-guided. One way to improve retention might be to identify users who are at higher risk of not completing treatment and to provide some supplemental assistance. So one way that can look is some minimal human contact with a coach who would help participants stay engaged in the intervention, resolve technical issues and things like that. But any kind of additional support needs to remain scalable because we want to have a large impact at scale, reduce the treatment gap. And so we can't provide a ton of extra support. We need to identify those users who are at high risk for dropout and provide the additional support specific to them. And so the current study aims to do two things. One is it tests the effectiveness of CBMI versus a psychoeducation active comparison condition. And it also tests the addition of a brief supplemental telecoaching for CBMI participants at high risk for dropout. This was a sequential multiple assignment randomized trial, or a SMART design, conducted with about 1,200 anxious adults from the community who arrived to the MindTrails website and enrolled, created an account, signed up for the study. The sample was mostly white women from the United States, but this was available worldwide. Anyone who came to the website was able to complete the screening. And this diagram shows the SMART design, which has two stages of randomization. So in the first stage here on the left, participants are randomly assigned to CBMI, 5 sessions of CBMI or 5 sessions of psychoeducation. And then a machine learning algorithm was used to classify participants. After they completed the first training session, we classified participants using their baseline in session 1 data as either high or low risk for dropping out before they completed the second session of the intervention. And those who were classified as higher risk for dropping out were then randomized at stage 2 of this design to receive supplemental coaching. This was 4 weekly check-ins with an undergraduate coach that was supervised by graduate students in clinical psychology, about 15 minutes each per check-in, or to just continue with CBMI as usual without any supplemental coaching. And then those participants who were classified as low risk just continued with CBMI without getting any coaching as well. The psychoeducation condition, we think of this as an active comparison condition. It was interactive. It had visuals. Participants answered questions as they completed the modules. And the modules provided information about anxiety symptoms, disorders, the prevalence of anxiety, causes, maintenance factors, the impact that anxiety can have on health, well-being, relationships, and strategies for managing anxiety. The attrition algorithm we used after session 1 to classify those CBMI participants as high or low risk for dropout used self-report questionnaire data from pre-treatment and session 1, as well as some passive features. So the time that participants were spending on a given web page, for instance, and some other passive features as well. And that's a random forest model. And then, as I mentioned, the telecoaching protocol was designed to provide information about the intervention, answer questions, troubleshoot any technical issues, and encourage skills use from the intervention in people's and participants' daily lives to help with this sort of transfer outside of the intervention session. We measured anxiety symptoms and interpretation biases using a couple questionnaires for each of those at baseline, after each session, and at a 2-month follow-up. And we conducted analyses in the Bayesian framework on a computing cluster at the University of Virginia using a piecewise multi-level model for our efficacy analyses and a zero inflated count model for analyses of dropout. And we also handled missing data using some add-on selection models. And so the Bayesian framework was a nice fit for its flexibility and kind of doing the modeling that we needed to do. And we had several pre-registered hypotheses. So first was we expected the CBMI group to outperform the psychoeducation group on anxiety symptoms and interpretation bias over time. So we expected the CBMI group to improve more. And we also expected the CBMI group to drop out at a lower rate than the psychoeducation group. So this was what we call our stage 1 hypothesis for the first stage of randomization. And then we had various comparisons of the stage 2 treatment arms. One comparison was the high risk CBMI participants who were classified as high risk, comparing those who received coaching to those who were randomly assigned to not receive the supplemental telecoaching. We thought the coaching would help and that the coaching group would improve more and show less dropout than the group that didn't get coaching. We also compared the CBMI low-risk group to the CBMI high-risk group that did not receive coaching. This was sort of an exploratory non-directional analysis in terms of efficacy, but for dropout, we expected that if you were classified as low risk for dropout, that you should actually drop out less than if you were classified as a high risk CBMI participant and didn't receive any coaching. Both of these groups didn't receive coaching. So this is kind of a test of low risk versus high risk. So of course, there's not randomization here, so we can't make a causal claim about this. Our third comparison at stage 2 was the high-risk coaching group versus the low-risk coaching group. And the idea here was to see whether receiving the supplemental coaching would sort of buffer against being at high risk for dropout. Although this was also a non-directional, more exploratory comparison. So what did we find? We found that for the CBMI group, it did improve significantly more than the psychoeducation group in terms of efficacy. Interestingly, we found that the CBMI group had higher rates of dropout than the psychoeducation group. I'll go into those results a little bit more in the next 2 slides. In terms of our stage 2 comparisons of the various groups over here, we didn't find any significant differences. And that's across all of our outcomes for efficacy and then also for dropout. So I'm going to focus on the CBMI versus psychoeducation comparison. So we had several outcomes for interpretation biases. We looked at positive interpretation bias. This is a tendency to interpret ambiguous situations positively. We also looked at negative bias and then anxiety symptoms. So these are just some sample outcomes. And as you can see, on the x-axis is the assessment point, baseline sessions 1 through 5, and then 2-month follow-up. And the y-axis shows the level of bias. The CBMI group is in green, psychoeducation is in orange. As you can see, the CBMI group is improving at a significantly greater rate than the psychoeducation group, although both groups did significantly improve. The CBMI group's slope during this treatment phase from baseline to session 5 was significantly greater than that for psychoeducation, leading the between groups effect size at session 5 to be about 1. So this was a large effect size for the mean levels of the outcome at session 5. Across all of our outcomes, we did see some significant loss in treatment gains from session 5 to follow-up. But looking at the between groups effect size from baseline all the way to follow-up, which takes into account the trajectories both during treatment and during follow-up, that between groups effect size of follow-up still favored the CBMI group, and it was still a significant difference at follow-up. Although at a smaller effect size, you can see here more of a medium effect size than a larger effect size. So that's an example outcome for positive bias. This was the outcome that had the sort of greatest magnitude of effects. And then this is an example outcome on the right for anxiety symptoms based on the OASIS measure. And there's a similar pattern of results. In this case, we want anxiety to go down. So you can see that CBMI group has a steeper decreasing slope than the psychoeducation group. There is still a significant loss in treatment gains from session 5 to follow-up. And there's a small yet significant difference, though, still between the groups at follow-up. So small to medium effect size between the groups at session 5, and then much smaller effect size at follow-up for anxiety symptoms. And this is kind of what we see typically in CBMI studies, that we tend to be better at shifting bias than at shifting anxiety symptoms themselves. Although this study was very consistent, that across all of our outcomes, we did see the hypothesized effects for CBMI.
Jeremy,
yes.
Sorry.
1 minute left?
Yeah.
Thank you. In terms of dropout, I mentioned that unexpectedly the CBMI group dropped out significantly more than the psychoeducation group. Probability of not completing treatment for CBMI was about 60%. Psychoeducation was 40%. And in terms of number of incomplete sessions, out of 5 potential incomplete sessions, the CBMI group had 3.5 versus psychoeducation 3.2. So in summary, as I close, the CBMI group outperformed psychoeducation for improving interpretation bias and anxiety, which is what we expected, but unexpectedly, they were less likely to complete treatment. No significant differences between the coaching and non-coaching group. And so telecoaching may not help the high-risk participants, at least from this study, suggests that. And interestingly, the dropout risk classification after session 1 may not predict retention over the course of the trial, given that we didn't see any significant differences between the low risk and high risk groups in terms of actual treatment completion. So we're looking into this more. We need to consider the model performance of the algorithm in terms of actually predicting dropout at session 2, for instance, which was kind of what it was trained to do. So anyway, we're in process of writing this up, and we'll have the data and everything will be open, and happy to take questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for one quick question.
Sorry if I missed this, but I'm just kind of curious if we've considered if participants who are less likely to complete treatment, might be also the ones who are less likely to have an improvement in bias and anxiety.
That's really interesting. Yeah, really interesting question of, like what kind of predicts dropout. And so we haven't looked at that specifically. I think it's interesting. The missing data is a huge problem, I think, in our field. And particularly in this study, based on the design. So treatment and assessment happened in series. So there's a baseline assessment, session 1 training, session 1 assessment, then session 2 training, session 2 assessment, and so on, rather than treatment and assessment happening in parallel. And so if somebody drops out, we don't have any, they didn't complete any subsequent treatment, but they also didn't complete any subsequent assessment. So we actually don't know kind of how they ended up doing, whether they were improving and that's why they dropped out, or were they getting worse and not getting what they needed and that's why they dropped out. So one kind of next step, I think, for this, for our team's work, and we're starting to do this in future studies, is to do assessment and treatment in parallel, so that if someone drops treatment, we can still get assessment data and have a little bit more insight into the kinds of issues that you're raising. Great question.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Next up, we'll have Dr. Paula Wilburn on an inclusive AI-assisted coaching model.
Helps when you unmute yourself. Can you guys see my slides okay? Okay. I want to start just telling you, let me see if I can move my slides okay. Yes, I know I'm sharing. Okay, great. First, I want to just tell you a little bit about myself in kind of the spirit, I think, of the purpose of the conference, which is to bring together, academic researchers, clinicians, and folks working in industry. My name is Paula Wilburn. I'm a psychologist, founder, and CEO at Sibley. Prior to founding Sibley, like many of you, I started off in academic research with a focus on program evaluation. So how do we, not necessarily generating new treatments, effective treatments, but how do we take the effective treatments we have, implement them in real world settings, and then evaluate if they work? I went from doing that work into clinical and leadership roles within the VA healthcare system. So from academic to clinical and implementation roles, and then jumped out from there to found Sibley. And just to tell you a little bit more, in 2011, I was part of a work group tasked with expanding quality and access to care in response to the veteran suicide crisis. In that role, I trained over 1,200 clinical staff throughout VA in empirically supported treatments and evaluated those treatments. In 2016, we'd done great work at VA, but I saw an opportunity to leave that clinical role and jump into digital health to move faster, make better use of technology, and potentially reach a broader audience. So that's how I got here. I'm going to be talking to you about Sibley and AI, kind of the way we have built our AI tools to be inclusive and to identify the concerns and invite a diverse audience into our service. I'm super fortunate to work with just a fantastic team of collaborators. Sue Murch is from the VA Palo Alto. Other folks you see here are a collection of data scientists, machine learning engineers, and psychologists and experimental psych folks who contributed to this project. So I'm going to give you just enough context about Sibley to understand how, where we built these AI tools and how we're using them. So what is Sibley? It's a text-based coaching and navigation platform that provides immediate 24/7 available trained human coaches on demand. All of our coaches complete a competency-based training in empirically supported tools and DE&I relevant topics. And then we use rigorous QA to support their work to make sure they're doing consistently the things that we train them to do. And we use human oversight and AI oversight to give them feedback in real time. Our solution is intended to be a broad whole person solution. So we chose tools that are robust across conditions, things like motivational interviewing, CBT tools, mindfulness, those kinds of things. So we can kind of take all comers. So everyone who comes to us, we have a plan for what to do with them, starting with robust tools. And we use AI-enabled coaching. And what I mean by this is that we have found a way to take the warmth of human empathy, human beings responding in real time to our members, and support them with AI tools. We use AI to suggest next best steps, to surface insights like, this member is acute, there's a problem with the empathic connection that's happening in this conversation, this member's at risk of dropout, those kinds of things, to support our coaches in delivering high quality coaching at scale. There are 3 pillars to our intervention. We offer, I don't know how to make this thing go away. I don't know if it's in your way, but all right, let me go back. So there are 3 pillars to our value proposition. One is empirically based DEI informed coaching. So we train our coaches rigorously in a competency-based model, meaning if they don't successfully learn what we need them to learn and they're not responsive to QA, they're not going to be with us. So in order to be our coach, you have to use the things we've taught you to do. We then combine that with personalized benefit navigation. So what that means is they're sponsoring organizations like employers, schools, health plans who have services available to our members. And what we're able to do is we get to know folks in coaching, we empathize with them, we understand them, we get them motivated to take immediate action on their health. And then we can also navigate them to services that are specifically relevant to their needs, concerns, and goals. This is all delivered over text. So what this means is that we have rich, high-quality data that is the foundation on which our AI tools are built. I talked a little bit about what those AI tools are, and this is just to highlight this concept of this unique combination of real-time human coaches responding to our members, but then the way we are able to use AI to make sure the coaching is personalized, make sure it includes those empirically supported tools we've trained folks to use. And we need this to be efficient, engaging, effective, and scalable. So what does this look like to a member? Very quickly, members download an app. They go through a 3-step registration process. And once they've done that, within 15 seconds, they can be chatting with the coach. So it's on-demand, responsive, human, in real time. Behind the scenes, part of what happens is we use motivational interviewing to identify concerns, set priorities, create, make goals, and then deliver personalized content in the form of coach-guided exercises that are relevant to the concerns that each member surfaces in their conversations and the goals they set. The way we weave DE&I specifically into this process is partially in some of the structural aspects of the service. So members can be anonymous to their coaches. So I can choose a new username that's not my name, that just helps create safety on the platform. The intervention is 99% text-based. The exception to that is if someone's having an emergency of some kind, we will call them on the phone. We'll have a PhD level expert call them on the phone, but the meat and potatoes of the vast majority of our work is delivered via text, which reduces some of the social pressures that folks may experience, especially if they've had a negative experience in a healthcare setting. Just the text-based format can lessen some of the social pressures of face-to-face services. And then we have purposely recruited and trained a diverse group of coaches who identify as BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, or experiencing medical concerns and disabilities. We then take them through a competency-based training and empirically supported tools, and then also DE&I informed topics, including cultural humility, cultural competence, anti-racism, unconscious bias, effective allyship. And it's that context in which we create the data. And we call this high quality data because it's trained coaches talking to actual members. It's not going out, our AI isn't going out to the internet and collecting a hodgepodge of things from which to draw conclusions, but it's high quality data that then we build our AI tools on top of. It allows us to highlight topics relevant to diverse populations. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we did that. Our first model, we use latent Dirichlet allocation, which is a way of identifying topics within language, within a body of language data. Our first models were run on 16,000 high quality conversations and found a best fit to 40 topics. We saw that 86.4% of these topics from the unsupervised model had a fair to very good quality ratings. So when coaches went through, evaluated these models, the topics were related as 87% of the time, 86% of the time were rated as fair to good from a 5-point scale. Unfortunately, in those 40 topics, we did not identify topics relevant to the diverse populations we serve. They weren't common enough in the data to be detected by an unsupervised model. Unsupervised models mean you're running your analysis on kind of raw data and seeing what the model comes up with. So our next step in the process was to use a supervised model that allowed us to identify important but less frequent topics. And so the way when you use a supervised model, it means you're annotating your data in some way that you're feeding into your model. So we had a data coding team of 6 members from our coaching team who were members of BIPOC, LGBTQIA, and disability communities. We asked them to review a STEM dictionary of 3,200 words, and they identified 74 STEMs that were relevant to the topics of racism, LGBTQIA, gender, disability, religions, politics, and policing and legal concerns. We then went through and assigned a probability score to each STEM of how directly related is this STEM to these topics. And just to give you an example of, if we're talking about religion, for example, a STEM like God would have a high relationship to religion, but there are other STEMs, and I wish I should have looked at my list better, but there are other STEMs like preach. Someone could talk about a person preaching something, but it doesn't mean it's about church. So preach might have a little bit less relationship to religion than, say, God. So each probability score, each stem was assigned a probability score, and the cumulative probability score of these stems in our conversations allowed us to assign those topics to our coaching conversations. We then had that same group of coaches go back through the conversations that were assigned these topics, and we got a 65% rating of fair to very good accuracy in the conversations. And so we were able to take our unsupervised model, add some data tagging, and we're able to fairly reliably detect more diversity-related topics of conversation. So what is that? So what do we do with this information? So first off, it allows us to provide unique data insights into the organizations that we serve, that sponsor our members' membership, and highlight topics that they might have inadvertently, or you can say a lot of reasons why they might have overlooked them. We can bring them to their attention and say, your population is talking about this. And then we can add a sentiment analysis and say, employees in these locations are feeling particularly negative or particularly positive on topics related to these concerns. And then, so we can track the level of distress, we can highlight concerns, and we can just provide real-time insights into the needs of their population in terms of applications. In terms of next steps, there are things we're doing like developing member-facing marketing campaigns that are designed to invite diverse populations into the service. We will continue to build tools that meet the needs of diverse population, evaluate the quality of conversations that include these topics, and continue DE&I training for our coaches. We will go through, given that there's a discrepancy between the reliability of topics in the supervised and the unsupervised model, we'll just continue to iterate as we gather new data to improve the precision of those, what we call our guided topics. I think that's it. I hope I wasn't too far over 5 minutes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one quick question again. In the spirit of Jeremy's presentation, I will take the ambiguity of no questions as a sign that I answered all of the questions in my conversation, and it was so clear you don't have any questions. I appreciate that. Right. That sounds great. And if questions do pop up, feel free to drop them in the chat. And if we have time at the end, we'll circle back. Thank you so much. Thank you. So next up, we have Jennifer Kulk, who will be talking about standalone smartphone apps for mental health.
Thank you. Welcome. I will share my screen. Can you see the presentation? All right. One moment. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm Jennifer Kulke. I'm a PhD student at Technical University of Munich in Germany. And together with Kiona Weisel, Lukas Fuhrmann, Matthias Berken, and David Ebert, we conducted an updated systematic review and meta-analysis on standalone smartphone apps for mental health. So first, as we all know, we experienced an increase of mental disorders during the last 40 years, and also due to COVID-19, the increase or the prevalence of mental disorders is still there. We also see an increase of mental health abuse during the last years, but most of those apps were not evaluated in a randomized controlled trials. Therefore, our aim for this meta-analysis was first to identify randomized controlled trials which evaluated apps for mental health and assess the effects of those apps. So how did we conduct our review? First, according to PICO, we included participants which were 18 years or older with a heightened symptom severity or incidence of a mental disorder. And we included interventions which were standalone smartphone apps compared to inactive control groups. We only included RCTs published in a peer-reviewed journal. And the outcome could be symptom severity, response rate, remission via a standardized diagnostic instrument. We primarily looked into primary outcomes. So how many studies did we find? Including the prior meta-analysis and the search from our new meta-analysis, we found in total around 9,000 records and included 56 studies, which resulted in 54 reports in total. The main reason for exclusion was that it wasn't a standalone smartphone app treatment, and there was no predefined clinical cutoff. And when we are looking into the effects of those apps, we see first that most of those studies were conducted on the outcomes depression and anxiety, but also sleep, substance use, PTSD, self-injury, and suicidal ideation, and less often eating disorders, OCD, schizophrenia, and body dysmorphic disorders were part of those studies. We find significant effects of Hatches-G between 0.3 and 0.59 for depression, anxiety, and sleep problems, and non-significant effects for substance use, PTSD, and self-injury and suicidal ideation. Most of those apps were based on CBT, but other psychological frameworks were also symptom monitoring, mindfulness, and meditation, and psychoeducation, and less often, for example, attention bias modification or relapse prevention. The studies we found were at moderate to high risk of bias, mostly due to the selection of the reported result according to risk of bias 2 tool. So what do we conclude? Our main findings are that we find effects on depression, anxiety, and sleep problems. The app interventions were mostly CBT based, but we also see a moderate to high heterogeneity and a moderate to high risk of bias. So this leaves us with open questions. For example, and I'm open for discussion after my talk, do some burdened individuals need more than just an app? So is PTSD maybe a disorder where people need more than just an app and maybe adjunct treatments additionally? And does the dose play a role of this app? Yeah. I conclude with we need more high quality studies with sham control groups. And thank you for your attention. If you want to reach out, you can feel free to contact me.
Thank you so much. Any one question for Jennifer?
I have a couple of questions. They're pretty quick though.
Okay.
Is this published anywhere?
It's not yet published. We aiming to publish it like by the end of the year.
Okay, I'll keep an eye out for it.
Yeah.
And also in terms of, I've kind of lost my second question. Sorry, I got distracted. I'll mute myself and let someone jump in if they have something.
I was just going to make a comment that this seems like valuable and necessary work. So I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to see the study.
Paula reminded me of my question. Thank you, Paula. In terms of the responsibility here, many of these apps, I don't know if many of them were commercial or what, but who do you see as being the responsible parties for determining efficacy? Should this be the role of someone like an academic researcher, or should industry be responsible for determining these results?
Yeah. So first we see a mixture, like there are commercial apps, but also apps that were evaluated like at university and developed there. And yeah, I think there's cooperation between industry and academia needed to also implement those apps into like that you can use it more, or like it's I don't know how to explain, but yeah, I think there's a cooperation needed, and I think both parties are responsible for it.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to our final presentation. I'm sorry, I've not done a great job with time management. We do have a bit of a longer break, so I'm hoping that folks can stay a few minutes over to see our exciting presentation by Ian Sotomayor on Project Relate.
Hi there, thank you. And I will hope to keep this short. So hopefully it won't be too much of an issue. Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Hopefully this. Okay, great. Wonderful. Hi everyone, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Ian Sotomayor, and my pronouns are he, they, and I'm here on behalf of the Lab for Scalable Mental Health, directed by Dr. Jessica Schleider, and incoming to Northwestern University. Prevalence of depression among adolescents and young people have nearly doubled over the past decade. The COVID-19 pandemic has intensified an already present mental health crisis marked by a growing gap between need for treatment and access to care. Yet, despite decades of research demonstrating the efficacy of many treatments, access to treatment has remained stagnant. Traditional mental health care, or weekly therapy, is often time and resource intensive. Barriers such as cost, time, travel, and stigma block up to 70% of adolescents who meet criteria for major depression from accessing any form of care. One promising path forward in shrinking the treatment gap is the use of digital technologies, and specifically social media. Research demonstrates that there are over 80% of young adults searching the internet or social media for mental health information. Single session interventions, or SSIs, are intentional structured programs that involve only a single visit or encounter with a clinic, provider, or program. SSIs can be provider-delivered or self-guided, and they may be delivered in person or virtually. Self-guided, digitally administered SSIs are particularly potent for bridging the gap between need and access to care. Given their brief and adaptable nature, SSIs are highly scalable and overcome common barriers. By delivering SSIs via social media, young people can access evidence-based care for free, receive brief, low-intensity treatments with long-term effects that improve mental health outcomes. This is especially important for individuals with compounded barriers and who often receive little to no care at all. Thus, our team at the Lab for Scalable Mental Health collaborated with Dr. Joanne Davila and her lab at Stony Brook University to transform a multi-session, evidence-based romantic competence workshop teaching romantic relationship skills into a 30-minute self-guided online SSI for adolescents with elevated depressive symptoms. Our SSI is called Project Relate. Using social media advertisements, we recruited 705 participants who were between the ages of 16 and 20. While scrolling on their Instagram feeds, adolescents were presented with our ad and with an ad for our study and a link that they could click on to begin the survey. Of the 705, 366 participants were randomly assigned to the intervention condition, and 399 were randomly assigned to the control condition. Our sample was racially and ethnically diverse and included Native Americans, Asian, Black, Latina, white, and mixed identities. And we also had a sexually diverse sample, with the majority of participants identifying as members of the LGBTQ+ community. For those assigned to the intervention condition, we offered them one of 3 modules: insight, teaching needs identification; communication, teaching communication skills; and stay versus go, helping respondents with difficult decisions in relationships. Lastly, adolescent self-reported hopelessness, perceived change, and acceptability feedback. In total, the baseline questionnaires, completing the module, and the post-intervention measures all took about 20 to 40 minutes. Across conditions, youth found Project Relate to be enjoyable, understandable, easy to use, helpful, and worth recommending. Participants who completed the intervention found the activity slightly more acceptable overall, relative to those in the control condition. Importantly, across conditions, participants demonstrated an average completion rate of 99.9%. Of the overall sample, approximately 97% of adolescents reported they would recommend this activity to others. Participants in both conditions experienced similar decreases in levels of hopelessness, with those in the intervention condition experiencing slightly stronger decreases in hopelessness. Participants also self-reported perceived changes in hopelessness, where they indicated that after the SSI, they felt a little less hopeless. They also reported changes in mood, where after the SSI, they reported that they felt a little better, and changes in problem-solving capabilities, where following the SSI, they stated they felt a little more able to solve problems. The randomized control trial concluded this past May, and analyses are currently underway to assess the results from our 3-month follow-up. We are investigating changes in depression symptoms, hopelessness, relationship knowledge and efficacy, and relationship decision-making. Treatments for depression among young people need to address interpersonal adversity to help youth and young adults develop strong skills for creating and maintaining healthy relationships. Project Relate demonstrates the potential of digital internet-based SSIs to address the treatment gap. It also illuminates the importance and utility of focusing on relationship skills to cultivate healthy, fulfilling lives and treat depression. Using technology, social media, and brief treatments like SSIs, researchers, clinicians, and policymakers, and industry collaborators can begin tackling depression among young people and contribute to the cultivation of diverse digital tools. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What questions do we have for Ian?
I have some questions.
Sure.
Okay. What was the timeline for the post treatment?
We assessed our measures at baseline right before the SSI, immediately after the SSI, and then at a 3-month follow-up survey.
Okay. So what is immediately after? Like, so how much time do you have to make a difference, I guess? Like
between the post-intervention and the 3-month follow-up?
No, right at post. So you measure it before.
Oh,
and
I see.
then what is that like a week or 2 weeks or?
It's immediately after. It's like when they take the initial baseline survey, the baseline and post measures are all included within the same survey. And so they answer 2 questionnaires first. We try to keep it brief. Some of the relationship measures we used were a little longer than we hoped. But after that, they go right into the SSI, they complete the activity, they're given an action plan, and immediately following the action plan, the next page in the survey are completing the post-intervention questionnaires, assessing if there was any immediate changes in targets like hopelessness, how much control they believe they have over their lives, and some of those topics.
Okay, so it's like a same day, probably a same day. Yeah, okay. And are these single item questionnaires that they're filling out?
No, they're given a diverse range of questionnaires. We use a lot of Likert skills as well as a few matrices, and we ask them to kind of gauge where they've been at. We use, I think, the BHS4 and G87, but those were the ones that we are hoping to reassess at the 3-month follow-up, so we haven't had any results with those yet. But we use quite a few different questionnaires.
Yeah, because like the GAD7, like the question is about like how you felt in the last 2 weeks, so you wouldn't see a change. Okay, and what is the control condition?
The control condition is it's not an SSI, but it's a very similarly kind of activity that we developed alongside the active intervention condition. It's essentially a online module where they just click through and they're given 10 signs like red flags of a relationship and 10 good signs like green flags. and they're asked if they've had any experience with these, and that's it. There is no advice given, there is no recommendations, nothing is personalized. They just see the red signs and green signs for a relationship.
Yeah, that's interesting. Good for you for having that control. And then how is this delivered? Is this through an app or?
No, this is all online. We essentially built the SSI using Qualtrics. So the intervention lives on the Qualtrics platform. And when we created the ad, we basically copy and pasted the Qualtrics link into the Instagram ad. And so when adolescents see the ad, they click learn more and they're immediately taken to the survey. And so they can just take it from their internet browser or right off the Instagram app or wherever they access it.
That's great, just because it's so like anybody can do that. Yeah, if you use Qualtrics. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all to all of our wonderful presentations. I've learned a lot today and look forward to seeing everyone at our AMA session starting at 1:10. Thank you all so much.